In this chapter, I will introduce you to the rendering in Houdini, to the different rendering tools available, where you can find them, and how you can use them. Let us get going. Let me begin by creating some objects. I'll create a grid, a sphere, and a torus. And the first tool I want to show you is called the Render Region tool. We can access it here on this left toolbar. I will just go a little bit down because it's not showing on my screen. And you can access this tool by using this button here. I'll click on it and I will draw a rectangular region in my viewport. So now I've got a simple render of the objects in my scene directly in my viewport. This tool has also some parameters with which you can play. For example, if I want to get rid of this grid here showing the render and this red gnomon and this yellow edge around my torus, I can just turn off this transparency parameter here. I'll just turn it off, and now you can see I've got a better render without the grid, without the gnomon, and without those yellow edges. There is also other parameters for this tool, like this gamma here, which you can change to 2.2 for example. You can directly see the change in the viewport. It got a little bit brighter. I'll take it back to 1. And this LUT parameter here, which is short for lookup table, where you can load lookup table. Now let me get rid of this tool here. I will hit S on my keyboard to get to the selection tool. This way I got rid of the Render Region tool. And the second tool I want to show you will be this render button here. So let me click on it to show you what it does. It opened mPlay. I will talk about mPlay later. And inside it you can see a render of the objects in my scene. I will also get back to this button here and to the Render Region tool later when I talk about render nodes. For now, let me move on to the third tool I want to show you, which will be this flipbook button here. Let me close my mPlay window, and to show you what that flipbook button here does, I'll just create a simple animation on my torus. So I'll take the translate tool and I'll take my torus a little bit back. I'll set a key on it, and then I'll go to like frame 72 for example. I'll translate it a little in the X direction, and I'll create another key on its translate X. Now if I hit rewind and play, you can see my torus is animated. It's so fast because I didn't hit this time button here. I hit rewind and play, and now you can see it's animated. And now what I will do is I will just hit on this flipbook button here. This settings window will open up, and for now I will leave everything by default, and I will hit on accept. I'll wait for a second, and now you can see mPlay popped up, and it loaded a preview of my animation in it. So now I'll wait for it till it's done, and I will hit rewind, then play. And you can see this button, this flipbook button, created for me a simple preview of the animation of my torus. Let me close this window again. The methods we've seen so far, you will usually use them for testing purposes, but when it comes to your final render, you will most likely want to use the render nodes. So let me show you what are those render nodes. Let me switch my context from object to out context. I'll make this network editor a little bit bigger. So here, let me hit tab, and I will go to the render menu here. Inside this render menu, you can see a list of render nodes, or output drivers. Those output drivers are responsible of translating the scene into a format that the corresponding renderer understands, like IFD for Mantra, RIP for RenderMan, and Me for MentorRay. And then after translating the scene, they will run the renderer on it. You can create as much output drivers as you want, for different render settings, different render passes, different renderers, to isolate parts of your scene, etc. And this is by far the most powerful and flexible way I've worked with. Throughout this course, we are interested in Mantra. So here in this list, you can see this H8 Mantra, which means Mantra version 8, and you can see this Mantra node. I'll create a Mantra node for now, and if we look in its parameters, under this render target, you can see also Mantra 10, Mantra 9.5, Mantra 9.1, etc. So you have the choice to render with any version of Mantra you want. Throughout this course, we will be working with Mantra 10. And since I'm in Houdini version 10, so I will leave this render target as Mantra current, and it will use Mantra 10 automatically. So this is the first way with which we can create a render node. Just by hitting tab, and going to this render menu and choosing any render node we want. The second method to create a render node is by going to the Houdini menu, and under this render menu here, go to create render node, and I'll click on Mantra. And now if I look in my network editor, I can see a second Mantra node. So now I've got Mantra 1, which I created with this tab menu, and the Mantra 2 node, which I created using the render menu here. Now with the previous render methods we used, we didn't care that much about a camera. But here, if I try to render any one of those two nodes, I will go to render, start render, and I will render using Mantra 1, I will get this error window here. And basically, Houdini is complaining that it's not finding the corresponding camera for Mantra 1, and it's asking me if I wanted to create a default camera for me. If I hit yes, it will create the default camera, but for now I will click no, and I will go to my shelf, and here I will use this camera button to create a camera from my view. So I will control click on this camera, and now I created a camera from my current view. And now if I go to render, start render Mantra 1, mplay will pop up, and I can see a render of my scene. So just make sure that the camera you want to render from is pointed to by your render node. So let me go back to my out context. I will go to my Mantra 1, and here if I go a little bit down, you can see camera, it's saying obj cam 1. And if I go back to my obj context, now you can see the camera I've created, which is called cam 1, and it's the same obj cam 1 which is pointed to by my render node. You should know also that you can access this render command we used earlier here from start render Mantra 1 directly from your render node. So if I go back to my output context, and here I will select my Mantra 1 for example, and on top of its parameters you can see this button here which says render. So if I click on it, mplay will pop up again, and I will get a render of my scene. So basically this render button did the same job as this start render Mantra 1. Let me close my mplay again. You remember I told you when I talk about render nodes I will get back a little bit to my tools here, to my render region tool, and to my render button here. So now just look at my network editor where I have this Mantra 1 and Mantra 2 nodes. Now if I want to use this render region tool for example, let me get it and draw this region in my viewport, and now it's rendering using this default driver. If I go up to its parameters, you can see here it's rendering using the default driver. But if I click on this arrow here, you can see that I can now render without Mantra 1 or out Mantra 2. So every render node you create here, you can use it in those menus. Let me choose out Mantra 1 for example, and now the render in my viewport is using this Mantra 1 node to render out the region I specified. Same goes for this render button here. If I right click on it, you can see Mantra 1 and Mantra 2, and those are also the same render nodes you are seeing here. So if I right click on this button and choose Mantra 1, now mplay will pop up and it will render my scene using this Mantra 1 node. Let me close mplay again. Now if you have many render nodes, each one for a certain purpose, you may have some render nodes which are used by other render nodes, so they are not useful on their own, and you may want to hide them from this list here or from the list of the render region tool, this list here. So what you would do in this situation is just go to your nodes, select the nodes you want to hide. Let me say I want to hide Mantra 1, so I will select it and I will hit Shift D on my keyboard. You can see it disappeared from my network editor, and now if I go to the list of the render nodes for my render region for example, I'll click on it and you can see Mantra 1 disappeared here. I will take default driver, Mantra 1 disappeared from the list, and if I go back to my render button here, I will right click on it and you can see that Mantra 1 disappeared from the list. To make it show up again, you will get back to your network editor and use the Shift E combination on your keyboard, and you can see that Mantra 1 showed up again, and if I right click on my render button you can see it here once again. Now you may ask, if I hide for example this Mantra 1 using Shift D, and then in a later time I get back to my scene and I cannot find my mantra 1 here, and I forgot about it. I forgot that it was here. Well, there is a method with which you can hide and show your nodes and see what are the flags on them. You can hit T to switch to a list view, and here you can see this list of flags, but my exposed flag isn't showing up here. So let me right click. It's outside of my screen, so let me try and maximize this window. I will right click here, and under columns I will turn on this exposed column here. Let me minimize it again. And now if I look at my mantra 1 node, which I hid 2 seconds ago, you can see this X sign here, which says that this node is not exposed. If I go to my default driver here, I can see that the mantra 1 is not showing up. And if I get back to my list view, I get rid of this X by clicking on it. So now my mantra 1 node is exposed. I go back to the parameters of my region tool, and now my mantra 1 is exposed. So if you have a lot of nodes, it's easier to use this list view to know which are exposed and which are not, instead of just using this network editor. And if you have hidden nodes, you cannot know they are there. But by using the list view, it's much easier. So let me switch back to my network editor. Oh, and I forgot to mention here that those hiding showing actions will also work for the Houdini menu on top, just like for the other menus. One other very important component of Houdini is the Progressive Interactive Photorealistic Rendering, or IPR for short, which we can access by going to this Render View tab here. Let me click on it.